people like me, maybe people like you, have trained certain habits over time. This is essential for us to talk about because if it's a discipline thing and you have ADHD, you're like, I'm just not disciplined, then that means there's no way you're ever going to be able to do the things you need to do. It's just the reality, right? If discipline is real and you can either have it or you don't, then you're screwed if you don't, right? So the good news is that's not even true. Discipline isn't what you need. The important thing is to be able to train a habit. And I want to talk about that.
Hi, I'm Jen Barnes, and you're about to experience how to ditch the old ways of doing things, embrace your neurodivergence, learn tips and tricks to function optimally, and love yourself, neurodivergence and all. Welcome to the Self-Loved Woman podcast.
Hey, it's Jen. I'm so glad you're here. Today, I want to talk about something that I've been thinking a lot about as I read Gary Keller and Jay Papasan's book, The One Thing, The Surprising Simple Truth About Extraordinary Results. And that one thing that I want to talk about today is not what the entire book is about, is discipline. My entire life have been someone who thought I was really disciplined. And maybe you have too, or maybe you know someone who is super disciplined or who seems super disciplined. Like for me with ADHD, I know what I thought was discipline, and we'll get into what it actually is. It was my way of masking. It was my way of hyper functioning, over functioning, high achieving as a way to mask my ADHD. And some of you might be like, wow, that's amazing, Jen, because I just couldn't do anything. I get that, right? Like sometimes ADHD, like we just don't, for whatever reason, that's not the option that we have available to us. And for whatever reason, I did have that available to me, that my way of masking was probably over functioning and high achievement, certainly at the expense of my mental health, because then I had anxiety and struggled that way. Also struggled very much socially with my ADHD because all of my energy was going into hyper functioning in school, right? And academic achievement. And I know some of you who listen, that's your story too, or similar to your story. I know others of you that you have a different story, and that's okay, because I think this episode will really speak to all of us. So many of us feel if we were just more disciplined, we might be able to get the stuff done we need to in our business. And I want to share that's not it. So we're going to unpack this. I want to actually start sharing that the idea of discipline is actually false. It's not that people are necessarily more disciplined. If you looked at my life, you might think I'm very disciplined. I get up in the morning and I write for 3 pages. I do my gratitude journal. I meditate, usually for 10 minutes, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, but I do that. I do a vision activity. Then I exercise and do some yoga, after which I get ready for the day, like shower and all that. Anyway, but that might look very disciplined to someone from the outside. And in some ways, I always thought I was disciplined. But what Gary Keller and Jay Papasan point out is that is actually not discipline. People who have done this, people like me, maybe people like you, have trained certain habits over time. This is essential for us to talk about because if it's a discipline thing and you have ADHD, you're like, I'm just not disciplined, then that means there's no way you're ever going to be able to do the things you need to do. It's just the reality, right? If discipline is real and you can either have it or you don't, then you're screwed if you don't, right? So the good news is that's not even true. Discipline isn't what you need. The important thing is to be able to train a habit. And I want to talk about that because I shared my morning routine, which sounds really disciplined, but really those are individual habits that I trained each of them individually over time. I didn't one day wake up and say, yep, I'm going to get up every morning, do my gratitude journal. I'm going to write for 3 pages. Then I'm going to meditate and do breath work in there. I forgot to mention that. I'm going to read from a spiritual text. I forgot to mention that I do that too. I'm going to do my vision thing. Then I'm going to exercise. Then I'm going to do yoga. That is not at all how this happened. each of those things came into my life at different times, some of them even years apart from each other. So exercise was the first thing that I bumped into. And I love to move since I was very young. I love to dance. I used to dance to the Old Dutch potato chip commercial on TV. My mom said I would come running and dance to it. It went Old Dutch potato chips, Old Dutch potato chips, something like that. I don't actually remember. That was just how she sang it to me, telling the story. But I love to move. And so my parents got me involved in dance at a very young age. And yes, I know I have some privilege there. I was in a family that could afford to do that and that were willing to spend the time and energy to do that. And it allowed me to get into movement. As I got into high school, before that, I was in softball and soccer, and then I played freshman year high school softball. I was not necessarily the best player on the team, though I was the most improved, FYI. Felt pretty proud of that because I worked hard. And so I was always active. I was always doing things. And I also did cheerleading and dance throughout high school. And what I found is that I wanted more exercise than what I was getting from cheerleading and dance alone. So I started running. And I would run a few days a week. And then when I got to college, I started running close to daily. And if I wasn't running, I was doing group fitness. And it was in college that I picked up weightlifting. And so these things came about, just even the movement-based activities came about over several years, if not, what's that, like almost 2 decades? That those habits of having movement in my body and moving regularly, and then eventually having daily movement like running or a group fitness class or eventually weightlifting my sophomore year in college is when that started. So I started to incorporate those things. And it wasn't until much later, like it was, I actually remember when I started a gratitude journal, it was 2006. So that was easily, geez, 10, 15 years after the exercise habit was there. Because I remember reading an article in 2006 in the American Council on Exercise's Fitness Matters. I was a certified group fitness instructor, something I did for 17 years. And I would get these Fitness Matters publications in paper because back then it was all paper. And you would get it. And I taught indoor cycling at the time. And on endurance days, when we would not really do many hills or jumps or anything, you're just pedaling on a flat road on the indoor cycling bike and indoor bicycle. I don't know that we ever called it that. But at any rate, people would be a captive audience. And so I would share tidbits from the Fitness Matters. And one of the things I remember reading and sharing was that there were studies that showed that people who used a gratitude journal that every single day wrote down at least 3 things for which they were grateful for in 12 weeks were not only less depressed if they had been at the beginning, that they were actually happier. And at the time I was like, what a bunch of crap. I didn't believe it. I was barely out of grad school at the time, I guess a year out, not a therapist yet. And so I was like, I'm going to do it and we'll see. And sure enough, joke was on me. After 12 weeks of doing it, I did feel a lot more positive because what started to shift is I noticed the good things around me and was grateful more throughout the day, not just when I did my gratitude journal. So that habit came on board in 2006 actually as a way to disprove this study, which is funny now because my sample size would have been 1, right? Like it just would have been me showing that it didn't work for me. But I even went in with a bad attitude and it worked well. And that habit started then. I did start meditating a little earlier than that, though I was much more of a dabbler until probably around 2007 or 8 when I first started therapy in my mid-20s, mid to early to mid-20s, my therapist had me doing mindfulness practices. And I remember reading John Kabat-Zinn's book, Wherever You Go, There You Are. So I was practicing mindfulness a little bit every day. And often when I taught indoor cycling, I would include a mindfulness activity, which meant I was doing it too, even though I was guiding it. And eventually that shifted towards seated meditation that was somewhat sporadic until I went to yoga teacher training in 2009 and started meditating. So you can see how far out these habits were. It was like 3 years later that I really got consistent with meditating. And again, that even built slowly over time. I started meditating for 1 or 2 minutes and worked my way up to 5 and then to 10. The longest I've meditated for is 30 minutes at a meditation center, but on my own is 20. And it doesn't matter. It's that I'm carving out that time for me to sit in the silence and connect with something bigger than myself. But my point is, it wasn't discipline that got me there. It was that I trained the habit. I trained the habit to sit and meditate. I trained the habit to do a gratitude journal. I trained the habit to exercise. And again, in 2008 is when I started actually practicing yoga. And I started going to yoga more and more every week, sometimes multiple times a week. So it was 2008, 2009 when I was building the yoga habit. So you can see how spread out these things are. While if you look at my life now from the outside, it's like, wow, Jen is so disciplined. But Gary Keller and Jay Papasan are right. It's not even that I'm disciplined. It's just that I trained habits over time. And when we do that, habits take less energy to maintain than they do to build. And so by having built these habits so far apart from each other, I've been able to really get into them. They just become part of my life, just like brushing your teeth or eating a meal, so that I don't have to think about it much. Sure, there's days when I don't feel like it. And some days I honor that. And I'm like, yeah, today's not a good day to exercise. I can feel that. And some days I'm like today, I didn't feel like exercising. And I was like, you know what? You're not going to be able to on Saturday because you're going to be at the cabin with your family. But you know what? You will feel so much better today if you do exercise. Because I usually take one off day a week. That's why Saturday is relevant. I realized I had an ADHD moment there, right? And so I was like, I could have an extra off day this week, or I could exercise today and know I'd feel better if I did. And you know what? I'm so much more awake and alert today, and I do feel better just having gotten that movement in. After all of this, gosh, it would have been like 2015, 2014 is when I trained my habit of morning pages, of writing 3 pages a day, just brain dump writing, stream of consciousness, whatever comes up. It was then that I started doing that I came across Julie Cameron's The Artist Way, where she talks about it. And I realized how valuable it was and how helpful it was. And I slowly built that habit over time, so that all these things built up to this really lovely, supportive morning routine that helps me in my business, because then I'm more grounded and connected to my intuition, so that when I'm making business decisions and doing my podcast, I'm more present with y'all. I'm more present when I do my coaching and my program. But also, the other thing that does is it helps my ADHD. All of those things, with me not really realizing I had ADHD at the time, have helped me function better with ADHD. I just had no idea. But what I want to say about this, and this is something interesting that the authors of The One Thing pointed out, is that willpower, we know willpower is fleeting, right? But that we actually need willpower to build a habit. But that's why we can only build one habit at a time. So if you read James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, you know that we want to build one habit at a time, right? He has a very nice way of laying out how to build a habit, especially for neurotypical people. He does not include accounting for our interest-based nervous system inside of it. And so when I teach the habit building in my program, Ascend, certainly that's something we unpack a bit more. But generally speaking, he's got a really good way of taking the 4 laws of behavior change and helping people create a habit or stop doing something that isn't serving them, right? You basically do the opposite of the protocol, is what he says in his book. But one of the things that I don't recall him saying, and maybe he did, is that when you're initially building a habit, there is some willpower involved. I've thought about this for a long time. In my other business, I think you probably know if you've been listening that I'm a therapist. And one of the things I noticed is when people are feeling depressed, it can be really hard to get themselves to do things, right? You're like, shocker, Jen, right? It makes sense because essentially you're in dorsal vagal shutdown, the part of the nervous system where you're shut down. And so it can be really hard to get yourself to do anything at that point, to do stuff. And we know that when you think about it from the nervous system perspective, any movement at all, even visualizing movement, will help get you out of that state. And what I noticed in my own self during times I felt depressed, especially when I was severely depressed in my early 20s, even mid to upper 20s sometimes, is that there was definitely some willpower use there. There were definitely times where I did not want to go to the gym and exercise, but I knew if I didn't, I would feel worse. And I was like, you know what? You're just going to go. It's what you're going to do. And you're doing it now. And there was definitely a willpower in that because I didn't want to because I felt like crap. Right? And the last thing you want to do when you're depressed is be like, yeah, I'm totally going to go run on the treadmill. That sounds fun right now. Maybe to you it does. It was a little easier of a sell in the summer and spring to go outside for a run, but in the winter it was particularly hard. But what I found in working with people who are depressed, it's like sometimes you have to take that first step, and that encouragement is not the same as telling someone to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but rather saying you may need to use a little bit of willpower to get yourself moving at all. Or working with your nervous system by visualizing movement or looking out the window, something to help you get more regulated so that you can get yourself to do something, anything, other than laying on the couch or in bed. That's not to say it's easy. I'm certainly not saying that. And that's not to say there's shame if you're really struggling with it, because it can be really hard, especially when you're severely depressed. It can be hard to get moving. And yet you're the only one who can get yourself to do it. So that is one way that I've seen willpower show up, where I've been like, huh, when we're depressed, there is this idea of willpower, but I've seen in other places like, oh, you can't rely on willpower. And it's true, you can't rely on willpower because we have a very limited amount of willpower in a day, and it gets depleted over the course of the day. The good news is you can restore it by resting, doing nothing, doing something fulfilling. There's lots of things you can do to replenish your willpower. But essentially, if there are new habits you're trying to build, sometimes doing them in the morning can be the best time to do it because you have the most willpower. Now, the hard part about that is with ADHD, we want things in our lives, things that we need to do in our lives, match our energy. So while you have the most willpower in the morning, your energy may not be suited at that time of day to do the habit you're trying to build. So that's the rub. It's okay. Let's say you want to start a new podcast, but your best time to be doing a podcast is in the afternoon. So then do you try and replenish your willpower at lunch so you can get yourself to do the new habit? Or do you do it in the morning when your willpower is stronger, but maybe your energy isn't as aligned with podcasting? So then the task is harder to focus on. And I would say the former rather than the latter. But this is going to be unique to you and each thing you are trying to add. What is most important, however, is that you are only adding one thing at a time, one new habit at a time. I go to these essentially mentorship retreats. I'm part of this program. And when I'm there, there's, oh, and I need to do this, and I need to do this, and I need to do this. And I come home and my brain is spinning and I'm overloaded and I'm overwhelmed, and then I don't do any of it. And it's because I want to do all of it at the same time. And so what I've learned is that, and I did this last time, is I have to pick one thing. What's the one thing that I'm going to focus on building that habit for? And then I focus on building that habit. But we can't be building multiple habits at once. And so what we want to do is select something that will give us the biggest bang for our buck. So if you are not doing any of your self-care, if you're not doing anything to align with your intuition or vision of your business or anything like that, you're not doing anything to help your ADHD, I would suggest that might be one of the better places to start. Because while it sounds like, yes, I just need to get in the habit of posting on social media every single morning, sure, that's a fine habit to build. It's just that's not coming from a necessarily aligned place because perhaps you're more scattered from your ADHD or you're not grounded in yourself or your highest wisdom. And so sometimes those other practices, whether it's a spiritual practice or a grounding practice, exercise certainly to me feels like a grounding practice, though for you it might be something else. But sometimes those can be the thing when we're starting out that if we don't have those in place yet can give us the biggest bang for our buck. But whatever it is you do, as you build that habit, you're going to need to use some of your willpower every day. So it's important that you're not adding multiple habits at the same time. Now, in their book, The One Thing, these authors talk about how long it takes to build a habit. And by the way, it's a complete myth that it takes 21 days or 40 days. They cite a study, I don't have it in front of me, but they cite a study that says it's something like 49 times, 44 times to like 100 and something, maybe it was 200 times of doing something to build the habit, but the average is 66 times. So if you do something 66 times on average, that can build the habit. Things that are harder to adopt are going to take more than 66 times, and things that are easier are going to take less. But the hard part is no one knows. So you just need to keep doing something for at least 66 days. If it's something you really think would help you, is to commit to doing that for at least that 66 days and then seeing like, how is it going? Are you getting close to having this be a natural habit? Because when things are a natural habit, we don't need to use willpower to maintain it, or at least not as much as often. So I'd encourage you to think about what is one of the things that you could focus on where you would get the biggest bang for your buck right now to help your ADHD, to help your business, to help your life, and to focus on building that one habit, making it interesting for yourself because that's essential, and removing any friction or barriers to doing it. Those are the two main things that need to happen to make it more likely for you to follow through. And then use the little bit of willpower you have each day to build this habit, maintaining the habits that you already have. One of the things that James Clear talks about in his book, Atomic Habits, is that we don't want to go more than 48 hours with a habit without doing a habit that we've already built. So I rarely go more than 48 hours without meditating or exercising or doing yoga or whatever, because otherwise I start to lose the habit. And I've certainly seen that happen with practicing yoga regularly. I have had a period of time recently here where I was not practicing consistently and I fell out of the habit. So now I'm having to rebuild it up, which is much harder than just maintaining it. So even if you can get yourself to do 1 minute, one pose, one word on a piece of paper, if it's writing, one thing you're grateful for, whatever it is you're doing, just to maintain the habit, it's a lot easier to build it back up than it is to entirely restart. So that's something to think about. If you have some habits, but you're having a hard time being consistent, just do something to mark the place in your day. I did that during COVID. I had a really hard time meditating long during COVID. That was a intense time for me as a therapist, and I think for a lot of us therapists. And so sometimes I would meditate 1 minute. But you know what? It kept my meditation habit so that now before I brush my teeth, that is what I do. It still is there intact. So if you do have habits, keep them in place, even if it's a smaller version of it as you build your new habit. All right, y'all. I hope this was helpful, breaking down what looks like discipline, which is really well-trained habits, so that you'll be able to get yourself to do the stuff that you know you need to do for your ADHD in your business. If you're not following the Self-Love Woman Way podcast, please follow. And you can also catch me on Instagram, which is in the show notes. And if you're having a hard time getting yourself to do stuff, I have an amazing free document for you. It's my 5-step Taskmaster plan to help you be able to master those tasks. So you can check that out in the show notes as well. All right, y'all, take care. See you next time.